Welcome back to All Outdoors Photography Podcast, where we share experiences out in the field and educate others through landscapes, wildlife, macro, and more, with photographers from around the world.
In today's episode, we have Charles Needle on the show. Welcome, Charles.
Welcome, thank you.
So you're an award-winning fine art photographer based out of Colorado who focuses on macro and tiny landscapes. To start off this conversation, in your own words, what is the difference between looking and seeing?
Oh, that's a very good question. I really believe that a photographer needs to learn how to see deeply or see deeply in new ways. So to me, looking is sort of the first initial way that I would approach a subject. If something catches my eye, so I'm really just more or less looking, primarily using just my eye and my mind, but when I'm really seeing, I might be involving my heart as well as my mind and my eye. So it's a way of sort of seeing deeper in my view.
Hmm.
Hmm.
That's really different.
So,
Never heard that before.
Yeah, just kind of a different way, I guess, of explaining it. More
Yeah.
philosophical, maybe.
No worries. Yeah. So you're basically shooting from the heart, I guess. I'm guessing you mean like the emotional reaction to the scene in front of you.
Yes, so my emotional reaction, trying to express myself through the camera as far as what I'm seeing and how I'm feeling, and trying to translate that vision to the viewer. So yeah, it gets a little deeper than just kind of documentary type work.
Right, right. So how does one I guess elevate themselves to that, how they take that next step to really see the landscape or the environment in front of them and then capture it on camera?
It's really not easy. I always say to my workshop students, photography is a performance art, and it's just like dance, music, whatever, painting. It takes a lot of practice. So just showing up, being there, quieting yourself. A lot of times I will just approach a scene without a camera at all at first, and then eventually look and see what's calling to me and pick up the camera at that point. And of course, for me, back in the days of film, I was trained to work with on a tripod most of the time. So the tripod really, in a way, is kind of a metaphor, I think, for grounding us and forcing us to sort of slow down and really notice things. And especially if you're doing close-ups, which is something kind of near and dear to my heart, you really do sort of need to slow down. You don't always need to be on a tripod by any means, but it's a great approach to a subject if you've got the time and the right mental attitude to approach a subject. It's helpful to use a tripod in my view.
yeah, for sure. And what was kind of the moment your photography approach switched from the, beginner mentality of just shooting everything possible to slowing down?
Yeah,
Kind of
it's hard
describe
to really
that.
pinpoint a moment. That's another good question. I'd say just over time, it just sort of evolved. I got into photography in sort of a different way, and so maybe that's why I guess I try and approach my subjects deeper. I had chronic fatigue syndrome, totally fine now, but photography became like a form of therapy for me in recovery from that illness. And so literally, like when I couldn't travel to the Grand Canyon or, places far and wide, I just got out my camera and went in the backyard and on my hands and knees discovered, there was beauty through the lens. So that's, I think, where in a way maybe that was the turning point for me when I realized, hey, this is a vehicle for, not feeling pain, letting go, just being in the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's tough for a lot of people because they like to see the big, grand, the vistas and the landscapes in front of them. And it's like, you're right, where it is, there's so much you can see when you really break it down to this little square footage of land. There's so many photographs potentially in that space too.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the exercises I've done with students is take them to a junkyard, you know?
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, there is beauty in a junkyard, believe it or not. So, yeah, and there really is a photo everywhere you are. One of my huge sources of inspiration and mentors for me is Freeman Patterson. He's a Canadian photographer, lives in New Brunswick, still in his 80s, is going strong. And he always did an exercise with people where he would ask them to keep the camera by your bed, or these days, I guess it could be your phone. And before you ever get out of bed, like force yourself to make 10 photos,
Wow.
with the
Oh
point
my
being
gosh.
there's, a photo wherever you are. Of course, if nature's calling, you can do that first, but it's a really interesting way of approaching the world and seeing differently.
Hmm.
Now, do you do that every morning, Charles? Or
No, I have to say I do not.
okay,
Uh,
all right. Well,
but it's great to try every once in a while.
mhm.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
And I want to circle back to something you said about your workshops. So you take students to junkyards. So that's interesting. Your work is definitely very nature centric, but you seem to kind of do some shooting in urban areas. So I think that's super cool.
Sometimes, right, yes. And a lot of times, if the weather's not cooperating or things like that, it's an interesting exercise. I don't do it often, but it is a place that sometimes I will take people.
Hmm.
Hmm.
It's definitely a different venue
And
for
for
that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
yeah, and then for kind of your flower stuff too. I mean, are you searching for those flowers, or are you going to botanical gardens, or what?
A lot of
Where do you
times,
go for that?
yes, a lot of times it is in a botanical garden, or like I've done workshops in Europe where I had a amazing opportunity to be able to photograph in Monet's garden in France with private
Oh my
access
gosh.
for more than 20 years. I have been taking groups in there to do that, and that's just a really special experience to be in there without any tourists. And so gardens like that are public, but then I really seek out private gardens as well. I'll be doing a workshop of English gardens next year, and a lot of them being private. And so I love anywhere where there are flowers. I've been known to just go to Trader Joe's, and get a bouquet of flowers and work with that on the kitchen table in the winter. So yeah, it's a great. I just love macro because there's just infinite possibilities, and there are, in my opinion, there's just so many ways to express yourself with macro because you can get more abstract and a little bit less literal with your subject.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember reading on your website. I think you had a like in your house like a little macro setup or studio. Like, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so I have a studio in my basement right now, but before moving to Colorado, I had a backyard when I lived back in Georgia. I'm from Atlanta originally, trying to lose the accent, but anyway, it comes in every once in a while. But in Georgia, I had a whole backyard with a garden and a waterfall, and I had people come and we did, classes and so forth there. I'm hoping to do something like that here in Colorado. Just haven't been here long enough to get all of that set up. But I just love playing with things like glass and mylar and water drops and reflections of things and just not necessarily flowers all the time. But I do, flowers are a subject that really I'm drawn to most of the time. And so, but I think what's great is it trains your eye to see, no matter, if you're a portrait photographer, landscape photographer, if you do, sports or whatever it is, architecture, just doing macro and forcing yourself to more see deeper and in a little bit more abstract way, I think is going to make you a better photographer no matter what you shoot. So that's kind of why I do what I do as well, in the teaching aspect of it, especially.
Hmm. Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about the philosophical approach of your work, but let's talk about a little bit about the literal sense. So, like, what exactly are you looking for with flowers and photographing them?
I really like to pick flowers that are at least maybe about 6 inches in diameter because it's so much easier to fill the frame when you have a flower that big. And of course, I'm drawn to vibrant color, and you can make a beautiful photo of a plant that's kind of on its way out or about to die or even dead. I've seen gorgeous photos of dead flowers, but I tend to like ones that are in pristine condition. Uh, you just want to try and use subjects. At least for me, I'm drawn to ones that don't have too many aberrations, just so I can play around even more. But yeah, that's kind of what I look for. And I also like setting up in pots instead of necessarily shooting in a public garden. I can't do this, but at home I have plants and flowers in pots so that allows me to move them around. and that way I can get a really pleasing background and control the amount of depth of field and so forth. So don't be too quick to plant things. Those of you who are into flower and plant photography.
What helps you exactly with like putting in a planter? Is it just to have more control over like I guess the growing process, or does it like help at all with the actual photographing of it?
It's really not anything to do with either of those. It's more about just being able to move the plant or flower around so that I can have that a certain distance from the subject in the background. When you're doing close-ups, if you've got a real shallow depth of field, if my plant behind something is real close, it's going to really show a lot of detail. Whereas if I have it 10 feet away, I can still get that color in the background, but it's going to be a lot softer and more pleasing, even at a smaller aperture sometimes. So by being able to control the distance, it's really more about the distance between the subject and the background. Um, it gives me more freedom to do that. I'm not really a gardener, so I'm not nurturing the plant or anything like that necessarily. I do give it love, but not the way a hardcore gardener would.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and you can control the light of it too and place it in certain like I guess spots where the light may be better for a photograph too.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. You ever thought about doing gardening a lot more?
I've
I
got an audio.
thought about it, yeah, but I just love photography so much that at least for now, I'm going to rely on others to do the planting and the gardening. But it does fascinate me, and I'm trying to learn as best I can names of flowers and plants.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so a lot of your imagery it contains like a certain vibrancy to it, and there's all these pastoral colors with it. Do those come out of the environment that you're shooting in, or does like post processing aid in? I guess it's like a visual approach.
Yeah, sometimes the post processing helps, but I really try to stay true to what I saw. And occasionally I'll add a little bit of vibrance or contrast or things like that. But I really try to stay as true as I can, at least in my mind, of what I saw in front of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you get into the editor, I mean, how long do you spend per image? I mean, is it really pretty much done in camera or?
I try to get it right as much as possible in camera, but I just enjoy being in the field more than I do sitting behind the computer working on images. With that being said, though, I don't know. I'd say if I had to pick an average, I'd say maybe a half hour or something with an image that I really care about and want to make it look right. But I don't do a whole lot of post processing and try to just get it right, like I said, in the camera as much as I can. I guess that just comes from the days of film where you kind of had to get it right, especially slide film.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it's definitely a lot better, and I feel like it just helps, like from a photographer standpoint, it shows that you put more time into the composition or whatever in the field, and you took more time to really flesh it out because a lot of people will just shoot and burn, as they say, and then go and edit it, and it's like just a lot, it's just a lot more of a faster, I guess, approach to it, and it's not as good as the
Right.
results can be.
Right. I think, yeah, we tend to get lazy. I mean, myself included sometimes where we just say to ourselves, oh, I'll crop that later and so by getting it right in the camera as much as possible, it really can help later on. And of course, I'm always watching my histogram, making sure not to clip the highlights and things like that too, of course.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of your images kind of have like a little high key approach, so I'm guessing you're really pushing that histogram to its limits with exposure. Is that true?
I don't do a lot of high key, but I try to have detail in all of my highlights. So if I were going to really push it more, a lot of the highlights might get completely blown out. But I try not to as a general rule.
Right. Yeah. I guess a better way to say it would be like brighter. We'll say not so much
Yes,
high key.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So are you using a flash in these situations, like for the
Every
macro
every
subject?
so often I will use fill flash, but I'd say maybe that's only 5% of the time. Now with post processing and all, we can bring detail back into shadows. I will use a reflector. I have a small 12-inch gold silver reflector. I'm almost always using the gold side if I do use it, and I really am a big fan of using a diffuser because the diffuser, of course, is a portable cloud and really allows me to soften the light if I'm happen to be shooting on a sunny day.
Yeah, those are good tools to use. Yeah, with just controlling the shadows a lot more and adding that little pop of light onto your subject there.
For
Yeah,
sure. Yeah. And I do like the little LumaCube lights, especially if I'm working in a studio indoors, not so much outdoors. Those are just small little lights, that you can use to fill in shadows that way. And I also have a little flashlight that's got 34 colors built into it.
wow.
And it's really fun to, especially if you're just doing fine art flower photography and not trying to be literal, you can start to light the throat of a flower, for instance, if it has a throat, or skim the flower with a little bit of light, and it can create some really interesting effects by doing that as well.
That's really cool. That flashlight kind of reminds me of like harkening back to the film days with those lighting gels a little bit.
Yes, right.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, so yeah, shifting gears here a little bit. Maybe what's some other kind of gear that you'd recommend for doing macro photography?
Let's see. I'm trying to think. There is a device called a plamp, PLAMP, that you can get that will hold a flower still in the wind if it's blowing. And they have different ones where you can either attach it to your tripod if you happen to be working on a tripod, or something nearby if it's indoors, a chair, or if you're outdoors like a tree or whatever, or something that uh, allows you to basically move your camera around without moving the plant. If you clamp it to your tripod, you're going to move the plant at the same time as moving the flower.
That's really cool. Yeah, and circling back to you mentioned the loom cubes. What's your experience with those? Those like I believe mount onto your hot shoe. Is that correct?
Well, the one I'm referring to, I think you could mount it on the hot shoe if you wanted, but this is just would be handheld, and it's shaped like a cube. It even has a little diffusion dome on top of it that you can pop on there to soften the light. You do have to, control the distance at which you're holding it. If you're holding it too close, it can be too strong and powerful. And it's got different brightness settings as well.
Right. Yeah. Does it work together? I guess with like your camera, or is it its own separate device?
It's its own separate device.
Okay. So you have to really like meter and adjust your exposure accordingly for it.
Right, right.
Okay.
Yeah, I try to keep it as simple as I can.
That's
But
true.
on my website, I've got a whole page of gear listed there. There's a whole section of gear, and it has everything in my camera bag and then some. So if anybody's interested, you can check that out.
Right. And are you shooting with exclusively like macro lenses, or do you use extension tubes?
I love macro lenses. I started out with the Nikon 105, great lens, still use it. It's a great lens for portraiture too, of course. And then I sort of graduated to the 200, and I like the 200 a lot because it has a collar where I can, adjust to go vertical or horizontal. And it's also gives me more bokeh in the background, or kind of that blurry kind of artistic effect in the background, just gives me more working distance as well from the subject. So it's really important, if you're doing like butterflies, things like that, to have a little bit longer macro lens. And I really am a big fan of adding a close-up diopter onto the front of the macro lens as opposed to necessarily using extension tubes. But I do own a set of 3 extension tubes, but I'm more likely to use the close-up diopter because you're not losing light, and the real high quality close-up filter, if you will. It's almost as if they took the front of a lens and just sliced it off, and you get edge-to-edge sharpness, and it gives you greater magnification by doing that. And I like to think you can almost kind of get inside of a flower if you want to give it that sort of Georgia O'Keeffe look, and make your images look more O'Keeffe and a little more abstract.
So that is what I've never heard of that. Is that like so it's literally a filter in the front of your lens, or?
Yes, well, it's a filter, yes, and it's clear. It's kind of thick, and I don't know, it's maybe a half an inch thick, and it's on the gear section of my website, as I said. But Canon used to make one called the 500D close-up lens. I'm not sure they make that anymore, but there is a substitute now for that you can get. I think it's called the Achromatic Plus 5 close-up lens. It's on my website on the gear section. and you can get one of those and put it on the front. And the nice thing is, if you don't own a macro lens, or not sure if you're going to get passionate about macro, you can get that filter and still use it on the front of a telephoto lens, and it'll allow that telephoto lens to focus closer. It won't turn that telephoto into a true macro lens, but it'll allow you to focus closer.
Do you notice any like degradation in quality or sharpness when using that diopter?
I do not. And a lot of times I'm working at an aperture around 5.6. I'm not necessarily stopping down all the way because I'm trying to just show selective focus, like the edge of a petal sharp or something like that. And I'm a big fan of kind of that whole mush factor. I don't like necessarily to always make my images look, tack sharp at f99. Though you wish we had f99, right? Sometimes. But I just am much more drawn to kind of, the more blurry abstract image.
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, what aperture are you using there? Like, so is it like as shallow as it goes, or more like f8, or what?
Around 5.6 is where I'll start with that close-up lens, and then I'll sometimes go to 8 or 11, but I'm rarely at like 16, or 22 when I'm using that lens.
Wide open is too blurry, and then stop down is too kind of
Right.
diffraction problems
Yep.
and all that. So
Yep,
I
and
think
it's
that's a good
important, I think,
balance.
to always bracket your apertures. Not necessarily bracket exposures, but bracket your apertures when
Mm.
you're doing close-up photography. Shoot it at every aperture there is, and you'll learn a lot when you get it, into Lightroom or Bridge or whatever you're doing in your post-processing. So it's a great way to learn too. Oh, if I use that aperture with, at that background distance, here's kind of the way it's going to look.
Right.
So you use that, you'll bracket your aperture, but try to set the same exposure. You'll just stop up or stop down based on what you think you
Well,
need.
I'll be in aperture priority, and I'll just basically,
Okay.
go through my different apertures that way. Yeah. Sorry,
Got
I
it.
should have probably
Yeah.
clarified that. Yeah.
No, no worries. I think that's a great strategy. I've never thought of aperture bracketing, but it's a great point.
Yeah.
Because you never know. I'm sure you get blurry backgrounds. A lot of your images, certain apertures, there could be sticks back there that'll just be really annoying. And
Yep, absolutely.
yeah,
And
so.
and I think the background's as important, sometimes more important than the subject when you're shooting close up like that.
Mhm.
So, and
Yeah.
we're so fixated on what we're shooting, the subject itself, that a lot of times we neglect or forget about the background. And even,
Mhm.
using a depth of field preview button, if you have an older camera that isn't mirrorless and want to, preview how much depth of field you're going to actually get in the final image, you can use that depth of field preview button. And if you aren't sure what that button is or its function or where it is, you usually can find that in the manual of your camera if you've got it.
Yeah, that's a great approach though to macro photography is using that the aperture bracketing. Do you ever do any like focus stacking as well?
I don't do a lot of that. I've seen it and I appreciate it. And I really love the look of it, but I haven't done a whole lot just because I tend to want things not quite as sharp. But it is a great way if you're trying to get a blurry background, but then want a lot of sharp subject itself that's in front of the background.
Yeah, true. I guess it depends on the subject and how much depth is, let's say in the foreground of the scene you want to capture too.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, how often do you mentioned having the images maybe have a little bit of a softer look. How often do you do like a soft focus look with, you just switch on manual and just try and mess with that?
Yeah. I've given myself an exercise. Sometimes it's funny you say that to actually, if you feel like you're sort of in a rut and you're bored and you're not sure, what to shoot next, just set your camera at the widest aperture and put it on manual focus and just blur or defocus that lens a little bit and walk around and look at the world that way. I mean, you don't want to stumble over something, but it's a interesting way also of looking at the world. And you can shoot textures and things like that to overlay with other images. And a big part of my work is impressionistic photography. We haven't really touched on that yet, but I'm happy to discuss that because I'm super excited about all of the hidden potential in a camera that may have in-camera multiple exposure capability. And we're not talking about HDR here. It's basically sandwiching one frame over another. So I might do like a flower that's sharp and in focus with one shot, and then overlay in the camera a second image of that same subject that's defocused completely and not sharp, and you get a really cool, interesting effect. So I just think it's one of the most underutilized tools that's in a camera today. Not every camera has built-in multiple exposure capability, but you can certainly shoot it. And I've got a book that describes methods of shooting all of these things. And if you shoot it, then you can combine it later if you don't have a camera that has multiple exposure capability in the post-processing software. I have a free script that's available on my website that you can download, and it's a plugin basically to Photoshop where you just shoot all your frames, unlimited number of frames, like 100 frames if you wanted, and then you load them into this software and just hit OK, and it merges all 100 frames into one single frame, or however many you chose. So it's very cool to think about that. I know that's a long-winded answer talking about soft focus, but that triggered me thinking about what I call soft glow montage, which is where you do combine a sharp image with a blurry image to make one single image.
So are you? I mean, for that montage, are you taking? Is it like you're trying to get the background and foreground, different levels of focus, or are you just looking at individual pieces of the scene with that? I don't know if that's a complicated
Really,
question.
yeah, it's really just doing one that's at a sharp focus and one that's defocused. And so it's often, you may have heard of, it's often referred to as the Orton effect,
Mm.
Orton.
Oh yeah.
And you can try this with landscapes and other subjects too, of course, but with a close-up, I've got an image I'm thinking of in particular of like a tulip where, I actually broke the rule. Usually you're supposed to shoot the first frame at kind of a small aperture like f16 or whatever, and then the second one is at 2.8 or a wider aperture and defocused. But I broke the rule with this one tulip image I'm thinking about where I have the tulip sharp, but it's at a wide aperture, say 2.8, and focused sharply on that tulip. And then all I did second frame was to defocus even at 2.8, keeping the aperture the same, and then it made the tulip really kind of look like it's glowing. And you could also try, apply negative clarity in the post processing and get a similar look. It's not quite the same as in camera, but I just, as I said, get really excited by trying this stuff in camera and see what I can get.
And what software do you use to compile all those images?
I'm using just Photoshop to work with that script, and I don't think it'll work with Elements. If anybody has Elements, you do have to have Photoshop, and it's a free script, like I said, available on my website as a download. It's in the resources section of my website, and you just go to that resources page, and it's right there.
That's really cool. Yeah, I feel like it's tough to. It's weird when you think of like a blurry image as being one to delete or just discard, right? But like you're basically like combining the two, sharpen and focus, and creating something that's quite beautiful that way too.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a great thing, even if you don't get off on it as much as I am, you try it a few times and you might run across a situation someday where it really would be fun to work and be successful.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, you said about going and visiting the Monet garden. So like, how does Impressionism influence your work, and how do you get started doing that?
Yeah, so in a big way, Monet has influenced my work with that. As I said, have been taking people there for over 20 years, and I had a lot of opportunities during those 20 years to practice a lot of the techniques that I have in my book. And it's all about, just learning how to see what's going to work first. Scenes that tend to have a lot of color contrast or tonal contrast work well. And the perfect canvas for that, if you will, is, Monet's garden, because it was planted, for painting. So literally what I'm trying to do, I guess, is maybe I'm a frustrated painter, is using my camera as a paintbrush. So whether it's intentional camera movement with just, maybe a single exposure that's, I don't know, half a second, quarter of a second, or an image that's combining as few as two or as many as eight or nine or 10 in camera sharp images, just moving the camera slightly between exposures out of alignment to create the look of like a painting, the look of small brush strokes. You'd be amazed the masterpieces you can create, and they look awesome when you print them on canvas as well. So yes, Monet, huge influence, and also, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Freeman Patterson. He got me really excited about a lot of the things you can do in camera, especially when it comes to multiple exposures. There's one crazy technique where you rotate and zoom your telephoto lens, and with multiple exposures, it creates a spiral effect. So a few of the images I submitted to you guys show that. So it's really fun to try.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I never
Yeah.
quite seen that spiral effect before, and I think one of the images you shared with us is has that spiral effect on the flower, and it kind of like moves towards it. I was in awe of it. I was like,
Yeah,
that is really cool. Yeah,
yeah. They say in California it's kind of trippy, some of this, but
definitely.
I was just gonna say, I think that's what makes your portfolio unique. You're not you're already doing a genre that's less shot than others, and then on top of that, you're really experimenting. I'm curious. We didn't really ask you anything about kind of how you got started. So how did you discover this kind of genre of photography and really get into it?
well, as I said, it was through that illness was a lot of it, and that's what got me into macro. And at that time, I wasn't so much
Hmm.
interested in impressionism. It really forced me to slow down when I couldn't travel wide and see the beauty in small spaces. But then once I got stronger and better and started teaching all over the world and going especially to Monet's garden, I just started practicing and realizing, hey, my camera's a paintbrush. And as Freeman Patterson he says, think of your camera as your dance partner, then do-si-do. So I started to kind of do-si-do with my camera, and lo and behold, I got a lot of images that were not pleasing, of course, and a lot of outtakes there. But hey, it's all about just experimenting and not being afraid to make mistakes with all of our photography, whether it's impressionism or other subjects. So I just kept going with that and studied it more and more, and just became more and more excited about it, and that's sort of how it all evolved. So I now see that whole illness I went through as a gift, really, that got me into photography.
That's
That's
awesome.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Who
kind.
knows what you'd be shooting today if it wasn't for that? So it's a good way
Right.
to look at it for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Led you down this
You might
path
you
for a
might be a
reason.
bird nut like me.
Or just me that shoots a little bit of everything. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that either.
Yeah, of course.
I
I,
love all
Yeah.
subjects, but
Hmm.
just two areas that I've really kind of dived into.
yeah, you also shoot a little bit of looks like some wider angle landscapes that you shared on your portfolio. How do those help you with learning macro and vice versa?
That's a very good question. I really think of macro image as a mini landscape, and people who are terrified to do macro, or they just really say that's not my thing. I say to them, "Well, are you a landscape photographer? Do you like landscapes?" And they say, "Yeah." And I say, "Well, hey, think of this as a little mini landscape, and you still have the same proportions when you look through that viewfinder, and so that makes it a little less intimidating in that way." And the other beauty is you have complete control a lot of times over the light, and we don't always have that sort of control when we're doing a landscape.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, you got the landscape, and if you're shooting it at, like, let's say sunrise or sunset, you got to make sure that light's pretty great because it's going to be all over the sky or in the scene or whatever. But yeah,
Uh,
with macro, it's smaller scenes, so there's less control in such a way too.
right, and the best day to go out and shoot macro is bright overcast light. Macro photographers in general don't want a sunny situation. So it's kind of the opposite of painting. Painters want sunny conditions to show contrast, but with the macro stuff, you can do it with the soft overcast. And if it's sunny, use a diffuser to make that light more diffused and soft. Mornings are the best because there's less wind. Wind can be a real enemy, of course, when you're doing close-ups. And if it is real windy, I'll just go with the wind and maybe do something that's a little more impressionistic and see what I can get that way. So there's always opportunities wherever you are. You just have to be open to them.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so are I'm not. I know you do workshops, but are you a full-time professional? Is this your full-time career?
It is. I've been doing this
Awesome.
for more than 20 years full time. I feel very,
That's
very
great.
fortunate and blessed to be able to do what I love and actually make a living from it. So yes, I've been teaching and started out with backyard workshops, and then I did some private lessons, still do private lessons, and it just grew from there. Started to do talks at camera clubs, and I've had, and other mentors along the way who encouraged me to teach, and it does take a certain amount of patience sometimes, to teach. But I feel like I have that, and I get so excited teaching people at all skill levels. Whether, I've had students that don't know an F stop from a bus stop, and they're just really awesome, and they want to learn so much. And I've also gotten very turned on recently by the iPhone. I love my iPhone. I've started teaching a lot with that. It's a great tool for
Hmm.
seeing the world, of course, and capturing it, and of course, all the apps that are out there for post processing. But I think of my iPhone more than anything as a visual sketch pad. It's training my eye every single day to just see the art that's in my life. There's an image I had in the portfolio there of some bubbles, and those bubbles were just basically oil droplets boiling on the pot on the stove when I was making artichokes once. So I grabbed my phone and made a really cool abstract image of that. So it trains your eye, even if you're never going to print from your phone, or which you can totally do now easily, 16 by 20s and up with the newer iPhone. But it's just a great tool to train your eye more than
That's awesome. Yeah, and I will mention even the new iPhone has a macro lens now, which is
it
pretty
does.
crazy.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's not perfect. I've played around with it a lot, but yes, it's
Okay.
fun to be able to
Uh,
focus closer than ever before.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I've got some gorgeous close-ups that I've been able to make just using nothing more than the phone. And even if it's windy, the shutter speed on that phone will freeze something, and it's remarkable some of the algorithms built into the newer phones.
And I think the great thing about that too is it's introducing more people to macro. I mean,
Yes,
even if you have a camera, I mean, unless you have like a fairly close focusing lens, I mean, you're never going to be able to shoot stuff like that. So it's
that's
really,
right.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to ask on your workshops, I'm sure you get a wide variety of gear. Do you ever get iPhone only photographers on there?
I do. It's only in the last, I guess, couple of years maybe that I've had people come with nothing more than a phone. I've got
Wow.
people coming to do fall color in Colorado this fall, and yeah, they're just going to bring a phone, and there's not a thing wrong with it. I have no
Hmm.
judgment around it, and it's so
Yep.
funny because a lot of times we get asked as photographers, "Oh, that's an amazing image. Like what camera did you use?" Well, it's sort of like asking a chef what oven they use to make that amazing dish or bake that cake. It's at the end of the day not always about the technology. And I think today more than ever, with such a huge array of choice of what we can use, sometimes it's nice to just lighten your load and dumb it down and go very simple. But with that being said, the cameras out there are truly amazing, and it's awesome. I love my Nikon, and wouldn't give it up for the phone.
Hmm. Yeah, it's. I think it ultimately comes down to control too.
Right.
I don't think with resolution. I think 12 megapixels is fine on the phone. I think that's great. I think it's the control aspect.
Absolutely.
And like you
Yeah,
mentioned,
for
it's
sure.
like using a phone as like a visual, I guess, like a scrapbook in a way, or drawing pad, as you said. It's like it's a different application of it, but it's still photography at the end of the day too with it.
Exactly. And it really helps train you to compose because,
Hmm.
you're not
Mm.
having to worry as much about f-stops and shutter speeds, and you're just thinking, okay, what's inside these four, borders here, and composing an image. So I like to think of it as a tool for that as well.
Yeah,
Hmm.
definitely.
Yeah.
How's it been with like teaching like the phone users on a workshop? Like, how is it different compared to using like a DSLR camera or something?
Well, a lot of times the phone users are not using a tripod, which is fine. I mean, a lot of people with cameras aren't either, and that's totally fine. Um, I don't know. It's just a different style of shooting, and it's a joy to teach someone, period, whether they're using a phone or a camera. It's hard to really say if there are huge differences. It's just maybe a little bit faster pace of shooting, if you have your phone. But at the same time, if you've got the eye, it's awesome. There's no problem with doing that.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm sure there's iPhone photographers out there that we've never seen and just don't share their photos, and they're
That's
just
right.
around. They have it
Yeah.
with them for convenience, and it's
Yeah.
some high quality stuff for sure.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's great. Yeah. Talk a little bit more about on the workshops. What are you really teaching? Are you teaching how to find a subject, or what composition? What are you teaching on these workshops?
Yes, all of the above. I teach a variety of workshops. Some involve setups indoors. I do a couple of weekend workshops in Atlanta. I did this past March, where we brought in all kinds of toys, if you will, tools to play with, glass and mylar and water drops, all that, and different, paperweights and shells and different objects. And so there's that type of workshop, and that's great. I love that for more controlled macro photography. And then there are others where I'll take people into gardens and teach them about macro as well as impressionistic photography and even the phone stuff. So it's, yeah, just helping them see, helping them compose, get the right, exposure, talk about the various techniques. A lot of times I'll demonstrate some of, especially the impressionistic techniques. The one of rotating and zooming, especially where you get that spiral, is something you really do need to sort of watch me do before you can truly master it, I think. So yeah, it's just we just have fun. It's a lot of different things all at once, and a lot of times it just ends up being a form of therapy for everybody there, myself included. It's just escape from all the pressure and the worries of today. So I think that's another reason people do sign up for a workshop, and to be around like-minded people as well.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, we'll make sure to link all that below. Your gear list, your workshops, everything, because I'm sure many people will be interested.
Thank you. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
So when you do those workshops, are you like traveling pretty far away, or is it more localized to where you live?
Well, I've got some that are more local. I want to build more and local workshops here in Colorado in this region. Like I said, I'll be doing fall color in Colorado in October. But I love taking people far and wide as well. I've done ones in Holland. This past spring, I was in Holland at an amazing garden called Keukenhof in the Netherlands outside of Amsterdam. And I had a group there, and then I did two groups in Tuscany in Italy, and we also went to Venice. And then next year, as I said, I'll be in the UK doing private and public gardens of England. So super excited about that as well. I scouted about 20 gardens this past spring slash summer, and am putting together a detailed itinerary for that workshop. So yeah, it's kind of all over the place. I'm going to be up in Canada in a couple of weeks, the Bouchard Gardens up there. Amazing place. One of the most beautiful gardens in all of North America, in my opinion. Then I'll also be at Cape Cod doing private gardens there. So it's kind of all over the map, really.
So going back to maybe like a little bit more of a philosophical question, at what point does photography for you reach over into art, and how does one inform the other?
Oh, wow. That's a very deep philosophical question. Uh, you know, I think about how I've thought about this a lot in terms of all of the imagery we have seen out there that I would sometimes classify more as digital art. And there's nothing wrong with digital art, but at what point does an image become digital art versus a photograph? And so that's a whole thing we can debate on all day long or talk about. But yeah, there are lots of similarities, of course. I mean, Monet inspires me, and so I'm, creating my art, trying to paint with my camera, like a painter would, like Monet. So they do influence each other in a big way. I think the line is starting to get a little more blurred between art and photography just because of all the apps and so forth that are out there for post processing and things like that. But
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with that, those lines blurring. It's just an observation that I've made.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of natural in a way because a lot of people would maybe in the past think of like photography as being documentative, but like you're clearly doing something that's a lot more creative and abstract, and it's a whole different kind of like genre really of just photo taking really with it.
Right, right. Yeah, and just being a kid again in a way, not being afraid to experiment, play, and seeing what you can get.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
It's
I think
playful.
that's awesome.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah,
Awesome.
so this has been a great episode. So kind of wrapping up here, what are kind of the social media and your website and how can people find your work and your workshops and everything?
Yeah, sure. So my website is charlesneedlephoto.com, and it's Needle, no S on the end of needle. Charlesneedlephoto.com, and then I've got Instagram presence, Facebook, um, and I'm happy to answer questions over email as well. I really help support people on their journey in photography wherever they are, whether they're just beginning or super advanced and want to kind of take their work to the next level.
Thank you so much for watching the All Outdoors Photography Podcast. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and the video version on YouTube as well. You can subscribe down below, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.